Hello and welcome to episode 439 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, how are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a very busy week this week because obviously we had the autumn statement. So if you work in finance, and particularly if you're writing about finance, as soon as the autumn statement or the budget happens, you know you're going to have a very busy couple of days trying to pick through the details of what was announced. So actually part of the podcast this week is talking about the autumn statement, and in particular going over some of the detail that we now have on certain things that were announced. But Andy, I have to say, more importantly, how are you doing? Because it looks like you're hanging in there, because I think you've got yet another cold.
You say yet another cold. I honestly believe it's only 2 a year. I normally get one around the summertime and one approaching winter. This is my winter one. I've got my Lemsips and my inhaler ready to go. And yeah, no, I'm feeling fine, absolutely fine. But you'll know from the sound quality that I don't sound my usual self. But I'm raring to go. It's been a good week.
So before I tell you what's on this week's podcast, I just want to go through a couple of messages that we've received. The first one is a review that starts with great listen. It's from somebody who's called themselves Stop Working ASAP, which I love. 5 stars, started listening a few months ago. Good listening, covering a wide range of topics. Part of my must-have listen list when I go out for a run. Keep up the good work. Always helpful advice. Now, I do remember we did ask people what they do while listening to the Money to the Masses podcast, and we had so many people write in. So do feel free to write in again, because there were some really interesting ones last time. Walking a dog was always a popular one. I think there were quite a few people who did housework, so do write in. Who knows, you may get a Money to the Masses mug. So if you are Stop Working ASAP, do write in damien@moneytothemasses.com and you can have a free Money to the Masses mug. Now, by contrast, I've got a message from Liz, who wrote in, emailed us actually, said, love the podcast, I've been listening for 4 years or so, found you in COVID lockdown on my headphones when out walking. I particularly liked your fiscal drag story this week. However, I am concerned that you defined quirks of mathematics that I believe are quirks of arithmetic. I hope to receive a mug for my pedanticism. If I do, it will be the first time it has ever been rewarded. Now, I do have to laugh because I wouldn't reward someone being pedantic, but you actually spelt pedanticism wrong. So I don't want to be a pedant, but to pick somebody up for an error, you've actually misspelt it, but I will reward you for your 4 years of listening to the podcast. So I've got your email address. We will be in touch to get your full address and we'll send you out a Money to the Masses mug. So Andy, after that, I can see you're laughing. What's coming on the podcast? So the first piece we're going to do is covering the autumn statement. So I am going to be talking about the things that were announced and some details that haven't really made the press, and we're going to be talking particularly about national insurance. Then Joel is going to be on the show. It's the first time Joel's been on the podcast actually, and he's going to be talking about pre-approvals on credit cards, something we've not covered in the past. Joel writes about credit cards and loans for Money to the Masses. And then I'm going to finish on energy. So the energy price cap, the new level, has been announced for January 2024. So I want to talk about the implications of that and what it means for your energy bills compared to what you were paying last year and the year before.
Great. So as you say, Damien, it's been a very busy week at Money to the Masses Tales, where we've been poring over all of the details. Now, actually, some of the stuff, as you mentioned, wasn't actually mentioned in the Statement of Commons. We had to go through the paperwork and pick out the nitty-gritty ourselves. So we're going to be covering off some of those things that were mentioned and also some of the things that weren't.
Now, I must stress that there is a full article on the Money to the Masses website, which we will link to in the notes of this podcast. It will give you all of the details, because I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. So if you miss anything or want more detail, do check out that article. Now, the big announcement was actually national insurance. So national insurance, I'm going to come to at the end, because we're going to go into a little bit more detail what that means for people. But there were cuts to national insurance, which was something that was not expected and actually was quite significant. So I'm going to go into some of the other parts that were mentioned. So one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the statement during the Commons, so the speech by Jeremy Hunt, it was actually changes to investment. So there were lots of people speculating about what might happen to ISAs during the autumn statement. There were hopes that the ISA regime would be simplified. So maybe they were going to remove lifetime ISAs, combine stocks and shares and cash ISAs, so they were just one type of ISA. There were calls for things like there to be a British ISA allowance, so basically an extra £5,000 so you could invest in UK companies on top of the existing £20,000 allowance. There were people calling for an increase to the overall £20,000 allowance. There was lots of pressure regarding lifetime ISAs. So first of all, an increase in the house price limit. So at the moment, you can't use a lifetime ISA to buy a house that's worth over £450,000. The issue with that is that the limit has been in place since 2017 and hasn't changed. And so if that limit had kept pace with the house price growth, we've seen house price growth on average across the UK of 37% since 2017, then that limit on lifetime ISAs should be £607,500. Now, for lots of people across the country, that will be a high number. But in London, obviously, there are people who would be buying their first house that can't buy a house under £450,000. So what it means is their money is stuck in their lifetime ISA unless they want to take the money out and incur a 25% tax charge, or they want to use it towards a pension. So there were calls for that limit to be increased, and also there were calls to reduce that penalty. So it wasn't 25% if you withdrew early, it would be 20% in certain circumstances. And the other thing, fractional shares, so the ability to buy parts of shares, which has been made popular via the trading apps out there. There were calls for that to be allowed within ISAs, because at the moment it's actually, you're not technically allowed to hold fractional shares in a stocks and shares ISA, despite a number of the platforms allowing you to do it. So some of those trading apps, and they've got into hot water about it, and they were in this period of trying to work out what to do about it. So that was the kind of list of potentials. In the end, very few things changed. So the ISA allowances remained the same, £20,000, no changes to lifetime ISAs at all. So in terms of the maximum house price limit or those charges for withdrawing early, there was no special UK ISA allowance, and there was no real simplification of the ISA regime. The only thing we did see was multiple ISA subscriptions to be allowed. So going forward from April 2024, you will be able to open more than one of the same type of ISA. So at the moment, let's say you open up a cash ISA with one bank, you couldn't open up another cash ISA within the same tax year and pay into it. So you can obviously in different tax years at the moment open up cash ISAs with different providers. So each year you could go to a different bank, but going forward you will be able to do it within the same tax year and pay into them as long as you stay within the allowances. So that was different. Partial transfers between ISA providers will also be allowed from April 2024. The requirement to reapply for an existing dormant ISA will be removed, and the innovative finance ISA, which is not really used all that often, they're going to allow certain types of investments in there. So things called long-term asset funds and open-ended property funds with extended notice periods. And the fractional share issue is looking like it's going to be resolved as well now. So that is good news for people who've bought fractional shares within stocks and shares ISAs. So the other thing, I'll just before I move on investments, there was a line hidden in the documentation of the autumn statement that the sunset clause on venture capital trusts, so VCTs and enterprise investment schemes, EISs, we've covered them before on the podcast. We'll put a link in the notes to a show where we talked about what they are and how they work, but they're basically types of investments that give very generous tax incentives to people to put their money in, and that money is invested in small startups. So it's a way of generating capital for fledgling businesses, and it's been incredibly successful, and obviously very wealthy people like investing in them for the tax relief. But under the existing rules, the sunset clause meant that from April 2025 there wouldn't be the tax relief on the new shares or any new shares that would be issued from VCTs and EISs. So there's been lots of calls for clarity on that. The upshot is that they've extended the sunset clause to April 2035. So for investment companies it was good news, because it means that EISs and VCTs will still be a viable thing and something that will be attractive for people to invest in. Now, the national living wage went up. So for people aged 23 and over, it increased by 9.8%. It will be £11.44 from April next year. For 21-year-olds, it will go from £10.18 to £11.44 as well. The big takeaway for the national living wage is that they've effectively removed the difference between the 23-year-olds and above and the 21 and 22-year-olds. It used to be different amounts. So 21 and above, you get the same level of national living wage. And there were increases for people under the age of 21. We'll put a link, as I say, in the notes of the podcast to the article that gives you the details. Now, the big headline that we had, obviously, around pensions, we kind of knew it was coming, the triple lock on the state pension. It means that the state pension will go up by 8.5% in April 2024. And the reason that I say that we knew about it is because the way the triple lock's calculated, it's based upon things like national average earnings, and also it takes into account what the inflation figure is in September. So it ended up working out that it's going to be 8.5% uplift, which is obviously sizable. There was concern among pensioners that they might limp out of that or use a lower CPI number to calculate the triple lock. For those who reached state pension age prior to 2016, the state pension will rise from £156.20 to £169.50 a week. Those who reach state pension age after 2016, where you'll be getting the new flat rate state pension, you will see it rise from £203.85 to £221.20. Now, if you're concerned about alcohol duty was frozen until August 2024, while duty on hand rolling tobacco increased by RPI plus 12% from 6 p.m. on the 22nd of November. So that's the day of the autumn statement. Energy. Now, there were no announcements on energy. I only mention it because there were lots of hope that there would be. So last year, the government subsidised energy bills in the UK. Now, this year, there hasn't been any additional measures announced despite energy bills still being elevated. That is something I'm going to come on to in the last piece of the podcast. In terms of housing, it's quite interesting. Again, he didn't announce it in the Commons, but the Mortgage Guarantee Scheme, which supports the availability of 95% loan-to-value mortgage products, that was due to end on the 31st of December 2023, and that's been extended by 18 months. And there will also be increased help to pay rent. So the local housing allowance rates will now cover 30% of local market rent values. Now, there was also support for businesses announced. Things like full expensing, which is a tax break for businesses that allows them to deduct spending on new machinery or equipment from their profits, has been made permanent. And there are also some concessions on business rates, which again, you can find the detail in the notes of this podcast. The final thing to mention is that state benefits such as universal credit will increase by 6.7% in April 2024. Now, the big story which impacts millions of people is the change to national insurance. So the headline, Andy's going to in a second give you some of the numbers so you can work out how much better off you will be. From the 6th of April, they're going to be changes to national insurance contributions. So the big headline is if you're employed, then the main rate of national insurance, which is charged on earnings between £12,570 and £50,270, so between that basic rate band and that higher rate band, that's being cut from 12% to 10%. Now, that means that the average worker on £35,400 would receive a tax cut of £450 in the next tax year. And it's estimated that it's going to impact around 27 million people. Now, Andy will give you some numbers in a second, but I'm just going to go on to the self-employed. The self-employed have also seen some reductions. So Class 2 national insurance contributions have been abolished without impacting entitlements to benefits of any kind, so state pensions or benefits. And Class 4 national insurance, the contribution rate has been reduced from 9% to 8%. And that's likely to affect around 2 million self-employed people. And they say that it's going to save, on average, £350 of tax next tax year based on an average self-employed salary of £28,200.
Yeah, so Damien, if we just jump back to that headline 2% cut for employed people, I'm just going to quickly read through what that actually means in pounds and pence for the average worker. And I'm going to give some salary numbers and monthly savings. So again, anyone earning between 12,570 and 50,270, it is an effective cut of 2%. So it goes from a national insurance rate of 12% being cut down to 10%, and that's from the 6th of January next year. And so I'm going to quickly run through some numbers and actually tell you how much that equates to in pounds and pence, how much extra you're going to take home each month. So if you're someone who earns £20,000 a year, that means you'll be £12.37 better off. £30,000 a year, you'll be £29.04 better off. Jumping up to £40,000 a year, it's £45.71. If you're a £50,000 a year earner, £62.37. Now, because the cut-off is £50,270, the maximum amount you'll be better off by is £62.82. So anyone earning over and above £50,270 will be £62.82 per month better off.
And of course, if you take a family, there are two people earning, so a couple, then if each of you are earning the same amount, you can double the numbers that Andy's actually mentioned there.
Yeah, and just for completeness, you mentioned the cuts to national insurance for the self-employed. Again, that's an abolishment of the Class 2 national insurance contributions and the reduction of 1% of the Class 4 national insurance contributions, dropping from 9% to 8%. Let's quickly run through some numbers then. If you're self-employed and you have annual profits before tax of £20,000, you're going to be about £22.47 better off each month. So if you double that then and you have £40,000 worth of annual profit before tax, it's going to be about £39.14 per month more you'll be better off. And then jumping up to £60,000 then, it's £49.33. So slightly less on the self-employed side, but nevertheless it's a tax cut all the same.
And on that note, Andy, with a very nice link to last week's episode, because there were no changes to personal allowances, so I gave everybody a bit of homework. So listen to the autumn statement, look out for changes to the boundaries of income tax in particular because of fiscal drag. So where people can end up moving into higher tax bands. So some of their earnings move up into the higher tax bands and therefore they get taxed more. And that's largely because they may have had pay rises and that might be based upon inflation, for example. Now, we didn't see the allowances change. So although there's been a cut via national insurance contributions, there will be an argument that over time, people will be paying more tax anyway, assuming that people's earnings do go up.
Okay, so moving on to the next piece of the podcast then, and we're going to be welcoming Joel to the show, who's going to be talking about credit cards. Now, leading up to Christmas, we do get an influx of people asking us about the best credit cards, whether they should take a particular type of credit card, which is best for them. But also we've had some questions recently surrounding the question of pre-approval. What does it actually mean in terms of applying for a credit card? So Joel went and did the research and we've created a brilliant article, which we'll link to in the show notes of this podcast. And so Joel, welcome to the show. Your first appearance and long overdue, I have to say. It's good to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so pre-approval, what does it mean when we go online and we're looking for credit cards and we'll often see that note that will come up and it will say, you've been pre-approved for these credit cards. Can you walk us through the process?
So Andy, credit card pre-approval tells you that you have a strong chance of getting that card, but it's not a certainty. It's a great benefit because it can save you from hopeless credit card applications and trial and error tactics that can tank your credit score. However, the term itself is confusing, if not a bit misleading. Being pre-approved for a credit card means that the card provider will approve your application based on the information you have provided being correct. Credit card pre-approval always comes with the caveat that there will be additional checks made when you submit a full application, including a hard credit check.
So on that then, the caveat clearly states that there will be additional checks. Can you then ultimately get rejected? I'm assuming you can.
Yeah, credit card pre-approval significantly cuts down the chances of being rejected for a credit card, but it does not guarantee that your application will be accepted. The provider will carry out more in-depth checks, such as ID and fraud checks, and commission a hard credit check during the full application process. You may also need to provide certain documents to prove your address or income. This is the point at which your application could fail, even if you've been pre-approved. You could also be rejected despite pre-approval if there are discrepancies between the information collected for the pre-approval process and what you submit in your full application. This could come about because the information held by a credit reference agency or a credit card provider is out of date. If you then put the up-to-date information into your application, it could trigger a rejection. One way to avoid this scenario is to check your credit report with the major credit reference agencies and make sure it's correct. You can find out how to check your credit report for free in our article, The Best Way to Check Your Credit Score for Free, which we've linked in the show notes.
Right, so you've talked about the fact that there is information collected at the pre-approval stage. How does that pre-approval process work? Break it down in a bit more detail.
So credit card providers are able to gain enough insight about your finances for a soft credit search to offer pre-approval. For example, they can learn your current address, salary, and employment status. It doesn't harm your credit score or leave a mark on your credit file. Pre-approval can also come through one of many third-party services that match the information that you provide them with the criteria supplied by a credit card provider. Another option would be a lender that you have an existing relationship with, using your data to match you to a credit card. The provider will then contact you to inform you that you've been pre-approved for a credit card, even if you've never shown any interest in applying for one. Whichever way you are pre-approved for a credit card, The key factor is that the information that has been either provided by you or drawn from a soft credit check indicates to a credit card provider that you can afford to repay the credit you use. However, it is not a guarantee, and you will need to pass an affordability test and credit check as part of a full application.
So the pre-approval process seems to be a largely positive thing. It gives people maybe some sort of assurance that they're likely to get a credit card that they're after. So what are the benefits of pre-approval then?
It means you can avoid applying for cards that you're likely to be rejected for. You can seek out the best card that you're pre-approved for and apply, confident you have a strong chance of being approved. The alternative would be applying for the best credit card on the market without pre-approval, which would carry the risk of your application being rejected and damaging your credit score. You would then move on to the next best credit card, but with your credit file showing the first failed application. This would make it less likely that the second provider would accept you, possibly adding another rejection to your file, and multiple rejections in a short period of time can suggest that you're struggling to access credit and manage your finances, which can put off lenders.
Okay, so it's obvious there that one of the benefits is it can help you to cut down on those rejections, which can impact your credit score. What else is there? What are the other benefits?
So there's also guaranteed interest rates. If you're pre-approved for a credit card, you'll likely see a guaranteed interest rate figure. This is only guaranteed if your application is successful, of course, but it does give you a good idea of the value of that card versus competitors. Without pre-approval, you can only compare cards by the representative APR, which is a rate a provider expects to offer at least 51% of successful applications, so not necessarily the rate you will get.
Okay, so rejections is one. Knowing the interest rate you're going to be getting ultimately, if all goes well, is another. What about credit limits then?
Yeah, so some cards will also show a guaranteed credit limit when you're pre-approved. This is valuable because you would usually not know how high your credit limit will be until you've submitted a full application. You may see an illustrative credit limit or a credit limit range advertised with a card. However, knowing exactly how much you can spend up to if you're successful in getting the card is a big bonus, especially if you have a specific purchase in mind.
Okay, so if the pre-approval is based on you having to supply and provide more information, what kind of information are you going to be asked? What do you need to come prepared with?
Well, in some cases, you'll not need to provide any details at all to be pre-approved for a credit card. You could get a letter in the post, an email, or an online message to tell you that you're eligible for a particular card. This is usually because a credit card provider has been able to draw enough information from a soft credit check or existing data to satisfy its pre-eligibility criteria. If you're looking to check your eligibility online yourself and get pre-approved for a specific card, you'll have to give some basic personal information, usually including your full name, date of birth, nationality, and marital status, also some address details, your current address, past addresses to cover a certain period of time, and whether you rent your home or own the property or live with family, and also some finance and income details. So that will mean providing your annual income, how much you spend on your rent or mortgage payments each month, and also details of any dependents, which could include childcare costs.
Actually, I've just got a quick question on that. In terms of filling in that information yourself, I imagine there can be a temptation from some people, especially in the income area, of perhaps boosting that, giving themselves a little bit of a pay rise, if you like, to maximise their chance of getting a card. Do you think that happens? And if it does, what would be the consequences?
The fundamental thing to remember about pre-approval is that you're being pre-approved for that credit card based on the information that you've provided or that's been sourced from a credit reference agency. If when you fill out your full application, what you input differs from what has been sourced by that credit card provider, that could be something that triggers a rejection. Any exaggeration of income or temptation to leave off certain expenses will likely show up when the full application process kicks in.
And so that's a great word of warning there. Obviously, there'll be listeners out there who are perhaps in this situation and looking to apply for a credit card. I think perhaps the worst thing they can do is sabotage their own credit file by entering incorrect information. So that's something just to be mindful of. And so moving on to the final part then, is there anything that people could do in order to boost their chances of being pre-approved for more credit cards?
Broadly, there are two key ways. The first way is to improve your credit score. The second is to cut down on your existing debt. Your credit score measures how creditworthy you will appear to lenders based on the information in your credit file. The exact number can vary depending on which of the major credit reference agencies you check with, but improving it should make a difference to how many credit card providers are willing to pre-approve you.
Yeah, and we've just updated an article that provides some really good tips on how to improve your credit score quickly, and we'll link to that article in the show notes.
And if you have a particularly low credit score or you've had problems with debt in the past, you may need to rebuild your credit score with a credit builder credit card. Using a credit builder card responsibly will, over time, build up a record of borrowing sensibly and repaying what you owe on time. You could then move on.
And by better credit cards, we obviously mean maybe you can get better 0% interest periods on them. Perhaps the interest rate in itself is better, and actually the credit limits are likely to be higher as well. Okay, so we've talked about improving your credit score. Is there anything else you can do to improve your chances of getting one of these pre-approved credit cards?
So a second option could be clearing your debt, which can be a bit more tricky. Credit card companies will only offer you credit if they think you have enough money coming in to pay off the debt you build up with them and any debts you owe elsewhere. This could mean that you need to focus on cutting your debt before you try and apply for a new credit card. If you're struggling to manage your debt, it may be time to get some free help and advice. You can see a list of the free independent debt help organisations and how they can help you in our article, Where to Get Free Debt Advice, which we've linked to in the show notes.
Okay, thanks so much for coming on then, Joel, and we will link to the full article that we've put on the Money to the Masses website titled What Does Pre-Approval Mean for Credit Cards, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Okay, so Damien, bringing you back in then, we're going to be talking about energy. This came right off the back of the autumn statement, the announcement from Ofgem about the latest energy price cap. What does it mean for people?
So as you say, it came the day after the autumn statement, and given what I spoke about earlier in the podcast, that there were no new announcements of support for energy bills, then this is quite timely because we're going to see what our energy bills are going to be like going through this winter. Now, Ofgem, every 3 months now, reviews the energy price cap. So just to remind people who've forgotten, there was the energy price guarantee we had last year, and there's the energy price cap. And the energy price cap is by Ofgem, and what that does is cap the standing charge and the per kilowatt hour charge for gas and electricity on the standard tariffs for energy providers. Now, in the past, obviously, people used to switch around and get good deals on their energy, but in the last couple of years, that's not been possible when energy bills went through the roof. The cost of energy obviously spiraled largely as a result of the war in Ukraine. Then what happened is the government stepped in, had the energy price guarantee, which technically does still exist, but what that did was cap people's bills, the kilowatt hour charges and the standing charges on those standard tariffs. Now, that meant that last winter, the typical family, the average is based on typical usage, paid a maximum of £2,500 a year if you annualised their bills. Now, that's gone. So we're back to the energy price cap. So all you've got to think about is the energy price cap from Ofgem now. And that is reviewed every 3 months. And as a result, people are still generally on their standard energy tariff with their provider. So when the energy price cap is announced, that has a direct impact on people's bills going forward, because that is going to be the rate that most people will pay when we're talking about standing charges and the kilowatt per hour charges for gas and electricity. Now, this week, they've announced what the energy price cap will be in January. And I can confirm it's going up from £1,834, which it is now, to £1,928, assuming you are a dual fuel customer, so you have gas and electricity with the same company, and you're paying by direct debit and you have a meter, so you're not on prepayment meter. Now, those general numbers, just to remind people, are based upon typical usage, and for individuals, your bill will be very different. It depends on how much energy you use, and it depends on things like how efficient your home is. It also depends on how you pay. Like I said, if you don't pay by direct debit, then these numbers aren't the same. For people who don't pay by direct debit, then they're looking at a 5% rise, but the price cap will be more towards £2,058. And for people who are on prepayment meters, their bills will likely go from £1,949 to £1,960. But again, that's typical usage. Now, what does typical usage mean? Just to remind people, Ofgem periodically review the sort of usage that people have in the UK, and that changed recently. So looking at the numbers, it suggests we'll be paying 5% more than we are currently for our energy. But like I said, it depends on where you are in the UK, how you pay, what your energy usage is. But what's really useful for people is if they compare their bill to last year. So people often ask, well, what are my energy bills going to be like compared to last year or the year before? Now, there's a link in the notes of this podcast. I did a whole piece on this with a very nice chart that I created and details what the difference will be. But the typical household will be paying £1,928, as I've mentioned, this winter compared to £2,500 last winter. And that was the reason they had £2,500, if you remember, was because of the energy price guarantee. But we also had an energy support scheme from the government, and we were all getting about £66 a month. It was £400 in total across the winter. So it worked out about £66, £67 a month off our our energy bills, and that was either paid directly into your bank account by your energy provider, or it was deducted from your bill. So this year we haven't got that. So when you're looking at the comparison of the £2,500 last year, you need to take off the £400. Now these are annualised numbers we're dealing with here. If you look at that compared to the £1,928 that the energy price cap will be in January, taking all that into account, our bills will probably be about 8.2% lower than last year. That's what it will feel like net. So that's after removal of that energy support scheme, and that's after obviously the fall in energy prices. So if we go back to a podcast earlier in the year, I remember we did something about this. What would people be paying in the winter? And it was very much a prediction, and it was based off of the Cornwall Insight numbers. And I remember we said that people's bills would probably be about 10% lower than they were paying in the winter of 2022. And as it turns out, that is about what it will be. It's about 8.2%, depends on your energy usage. Now, I say it depends on your energy usage because the standing charges now, so they're the charge you pay every day regardless of your energy usage, are actually higher than they were last year. So theoretically, some people who had low energy usage could find that they end up paying more this year than they did last year because of that support that's been removed. So it's going to vary from person to person, household to household. But like we said before, probably 10% finger in the air is roughly what you're going to be paying less than last year. But if you go back to 2021, so before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, then that energy price cap was £1,216. Broadly speaking, we're going to be paying about 60% more for energy now than we were 2 years ago. So you can tell when you're doing your numbers, you're looking at your direct debits each month, you can use those figures to broadly see where you'll be compared to this time last year.
Yeah, and of course, you've explained it really well there, Dane, but there is a sort of a weird juxtaposition where we're kind of bringing people the information that energy prices are going up in the podcast, but actually we're saying that, broadly speaking, compared to last year, they're coming down. The reason that energy prices are going up in January, as per the energy price cap, is based on oil prices from the last few months.
And actually, that's a good point, Andy, because Cornwall Insight, who are very good at predicting where the energy price cap will go, broadly speaking, in subsequent quarters, their predictions suggesting that we are going to remain at these elevated levels for a while. So if you're hoping that it's going to suddenly plummet, these guys have been very accurate in their predictions, and unfortunately it doesn't look like the energy price cap is going to come down anytime soon. And we're not really seeing anything competitive in the energy market at the moment to be able to get any decent fixed rate deals. They're just not appearing.
And we'll keep you guys, the listeners, updated as and when these energy price cap announcements are made. And obviously this time next year, no doubt we'll be doing the same piece, telling people what prices are next winter compared to this winter. And of course, do remember, we've got lots of information on the Money to the Masses website, including details on how you can get help if you're struggling with your energy bills, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
So that is it for this week on the podcast. As ever, please do send in reviews. Like the two lucky people at the start of the show, you could get yourself a Money to the Masses mug. Do join the Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. Obviously, you can find us on all the other social media platforms, particularly Instagram, where you'll find a lot of content. We do push out lots of content on YouTube as well, stuff that doesn't even make it onto the podcast. I mean, we do updates in terms of interest rates, house prices, all sorts of things, and we also do product reviews. So do make sure you subscribe to all of those channels and share them with everybody that you know. So I think that's it, Andy. All that's left for us is to say until next time.
Until next time.